All right, Matt Stein, Matt Dow, the Guru Johnson with you.
You like that?
Nice.
That's Kirk Cousins, by the way. Let's go right to it. He's a senior sports reporter for the Sacramento Bee, covering the Sacramento Kings. He's also the co-host of the Candlestick Chronicles on Blue Wire Pods. He knows a lot about the San Francisco 49ers. We're going to get into both subjects with him. What's up, Chris? How you doing, man?
I'm doing well. How are you guys?
We're doing well. I guess the first question I'll ask is how serious do you think the Sacramento Kings are about acquiring Draymond Green?
You know, I'm pretty certain they'll look into it. And obviously you can connect the dots. Vivek Ranadive, the Kings owner, used to be part of the Warriors ownership group. I think there's a feeling out there that he would love to stick it to the Warriors by way of signing Draymond Green. Obviously, there are a lot of connections on the coaching staff with Mike Brown and Luke Locke. But, you know, when you look at how the Kings can improve, and this is just my opinion, but I don't know that, you know, say if they do end up trying to get Draymond Green at which would be at the cost of Harrison Barnes or any other perimeter shooting, I don't know that the Kings offense is gonna be anywhere near as effective as it was last year. I know Draymond is obviously an elite playmaker, and certainly the defense would improve a lot. But one of the reasons why the Kings had the best offense in the NBA throughout the regular season last year was because they could play 4 out and have 4 shooters surrounding Domantas Sabonis. With Draymond Green, there's a little bit of overlap with Sabonis in terms of having a non-shooter on the floor. And I think that might be a wrinkle that the Kings would have a hard time trying to figure out, right? Because if you remember in Game 7, it oddly enough, I mean, Steph Curry scored 50 points, obviously, but the Kings couldn't really buy a bucket in the second half of that Game 7 against the Warriors, and a lot of that was because the Warriors were pressing up on the Kings' outside shooters and daring Domantas Sabonis to beat them from mid-range, and he couldn't. And so I would have to think that that's going to be the approach of teams going against the Kings next year. So if you add Draymond Green into that mix, obviously somebody who's not a three-point shooter, replacing Harrison Barnes, who shot 37% from 3 last year, I think that's going to be something that's very different. So, you know, would Draymond Green give the Kings a small ball backup 5? That could make a lot of sense and fit what they want to do, absolutely. But in terms of what it's going to cost, I have a hard time seeing the Kings wanting to give somebody like Draymond Green $30 million a year potentially when they could go try to get somebody like Cam Johnson or Kyle Kuzma, who could stretch the floor in a similar way that Harrison Barnes did. So, yeah, I think emotionally, you know, given all the connections you can make between Vivek and the Warriors and how competitive he would love to be with the Warriors, I think while it would make sense if the Kings are spending that type of money, in my opinion, it would make more sense to go get another shooter and floor spacer as opposed to Draymond.
Yeah, Chris, that makes perfect sense. And speaking of Draymond, I told Steiny, you know, he would be a perfect fit for Sacramento. But I've also heard a guy you mentioned. I envision him with the Kings, Kyle Kuzma. My goodness. But also, I've heard OG Anunoby, and Pascal Siakam, like the Kings were going to be aggressive. Now, my question to you, if you had to bet, do you think Harrison Barnes won't be in a King uniform next year?
Yeah, you know, I would say if the Kings are really trying to improve and particularly improve in the playoffs, I think it might be time to move on from Harrison Barnes and get maybe a more explosive offensive player and more explosive playmaker. I think Harrison Barnes, his value to the Kings, and Mike Brown last year called Harrison Barnes irreplaceable. So I think if, you know, he called him irreplaceable over and over again. If it came down to it, I think it would be a tough decision internally for the Kings to move on from Harrison Barnes. But I think you can make a case that he served his purpose in getting the Kings being sort of the respected veteran in the locker room, sort of a tone setter, a professional who helped turn around the culture and you know, get the Kings from being a you know, regular cellar dweller to a team that earned the number 3 seed in the Western Conference. But ultimately, I think when you look at where the Kings can upgrade and particularly get better in the playoffs, I think it's at that 3 or 4 spot. They need more athleticism. They could obviously use more youth, given Harrison Barnes is upwards of 30. And I think that, when it comes to Kyle Kuzma or Cam Johnson or somebody like that, just somebody who can, score 25 points in a playoff game. And obviously Harrison Barnes was unable to do that for the Kings last year. So I think the main goal for the Kings this year has to be, how can we become a better playoff team? And I think potentially moving on from Harrison Barnes and getting a more dynamic and explosive scorer on the wing to complement the Aaron Fox and Domantas Sabonis would be the best way to do that.
Chris Biderman joining us on 95.7 The Game. He's a senior sports writer for the Sacramento Bee, eminently familiar with the Sacramento Kings and the San Francisco 49ers. Let's jump to the 49ers because there's obviously some things going around with their quarterback position. Mike Florio said he expects a tug of war between the Rams and the 49ers for Kirk Cousins next year. Let's put that off to the side for a second and just talk about Brock Purdy being in Jacksonville. And how do you, if assuming Brock Purdy is ready opening day, who's the backup and who's 3?
Yeah, I guess that'll come down to training camp. I think right now, from everything you hear, based on, I guess, sort of experience within the league, I think people are pointing towards Sam Darnold maybe having an edge up on Trey Lance, but I think obviously people view Trey Lance as having the higher ceiling. So I think it's looking like a situation that Trey Lance is going to have to snatch that job from Sam Darnold, the backup job, and whether that's fair or not, that's obviously up for debate. But I think when it comes to Trey Lance and Kyle Shanahan, he really his whole goal is to win the Super Bowl, obviously, and he's tired of coming up short, and it doesn't feel like the 49ers have much of a tolerance for letting an inexperienced guy take their lumps, which could potentially cost them games, which could potentially cost them seeding in the playoffs, which could potentially cost them, whether a home game in January versus a trip to Philadelphia in January, right? So I think Kyle Shanahan is going to lean towards the more experienced guy in Sam Darnold. If it comes down to it, if it's a wash in training camp and both guys, neither one is really differentiating themselves from the other, I think the 49ers are looking at Trey Lance like he doesn't have the equity of being a guy that they invested 3 first-round picks in anymore. They're trying to win the Super Bowl, and they're not gonna look at it like they're pot committed on Trey Lance anymore. They're gonna try to find whoever the best backup quarterback is. And so I think because Trey Lance is so inexperienced, he's really going to have to prove that he's at a different level than Sam Darnold. I don't know. That's just how I think Kyle Shanahan is looking at it. In my opinion, I think Trey Lance clearly has a higher ceiling. And if you were to ask me, I think if Trey Lance did have a full season as a starter, you would see him get incrementally better, like we saw with Jimmy Garoppolo. Over and over again, when he was healthy, he played his much better football in November and December than he did in September and October over the years. And I think the same would be true about Trey Lance. And so, it's an interesting situation to be sure, but I think ultimately we're not going to have that answer until we see these guys battle it out in training camp in the preseason. And for the first time, really, we're going to have a true quarterback competition because Kyle Shanahan sort of shied away from having a quarterback competition in the past, but we might actually see it between Sam Darnold and Trey Lance this summer.
Yeah, good stuff, Chris. And my partner, I'm excited about it. He's making fun of me because I'm excited about everything, but that's going to play itself out. I can't wait. Let me ask you this because I need your help. We were having a fascinating conversation about Kyle Shanahan, his 7 years, and yet not that franchise quarterback like a Dak, a Cousins, a Tannehill, or a Josh Allen, all who have not won as much as Jimmy as a Niner. And then we saw what Kyle did with Brock Purdy. How do you look at it? Because I want to celebrate Kyle on one hand for doing all that winning without your prototypical non-franchise quarterback, but yet is there any merit to They don't have their franchise quarterback. How do you see it, and where do you stand?
Yeah, it's really confounding, right? I think Kyle Shanahan deserves credit for being self-aware to the point as an offensive coach he can say, you know what, I really need an elite defense if we're going to win a Super Bowl. I think there are a lot of offensive coaches who would just say, yeah, let me pour all my resources into the offensive side of the ball, and if we just have a mediocre defense, we'll be good enough to win because I'm smart enough to build a really good offense, and that'll be enough. But Kyle Shanahan looked at it, and him and John Lynch, the first decision they made, and this sort of goes back to Kirk Cousins, was like, let's build out the roster, let's try to load up our defense, and then eventually get the quarterback, which at the time, in 2017, they were looking at adding Kirk Cousins in free agency in 2018 before the Jimmy Garoppolo trade landed in their lap. But I think Kyle Shanahan deserves credit for saying, I need an elite defense. No matter how good I am schematically as a play caller, as an offensive designer, we need to have an elite defense if we're going to contend. But, it goes back. It's sort of the long-standing conflict when it comes to NFL roster construction. It's should the head coach be the one who has final say on all the roster decisions? And I think it's fair to say that it's confounding given that how good of an offensive coach Kyle Shanahan is and how well he works with quarterbacks, identifying quarterbacks and maybe picking quarterbacks or choosing their strategy when it comes to evaluating quarterbacks has probably been his biggest downfall, right? Because in 2017, when they first got here, they could have taken Patrick Mahomes, they could have taken Deshaun Watson, but they were set on going to get Kirk Cousins in free agency in 2018, so they didn't really do a whole lot of work on those quarterbacks. And obviously Patrick Mahomes has turned into, arguably the best quarterback in the league and someone who's on a Hall of Fame trajectory who beat the 49ers in a Super Bowl, right? So as good as Kyle Shanahan is offensively, he deserves a ton of credit for building the 49ers offense the way he has and acquiring all the skill position guys. And being able to lure Trent Williams in a pretty team-friendly trade from Washington. But at the same time, you can look at it and say, well, if you were better at evaluating quarterbacks and being a guy who had a better plan when it came to choosing quarterbacks, then maybe the 49ers would have won a Super Bowl by now. But, you can look back on 2017 in hindsight and say, man, if they took a harder look at Pat Mahomes or Deshaun Watson, obviously the Deshaun Watson off-the-field stuff happened way later and and is not endearing to him at all. But if you look at just passing on Patrick Mahomes and not even considering him in the draft and what a sliding doors moment that could have been for the 49ers, that's a huge deal. But I still think, all of that said, Kyle Shanahan's probably one of the 5 best coaches in the league, and a lot of teams would love to have him. But when you coach the 49ers and the expectation is win a Super Bowl, or being contend for Super Bowls year after year, it's going to be tough when you come close and you ultimately end up not winning because of your quarterback play.
Right. Hey, Chris, thank you for your time. Really appreciate it. Good stuff on both the Kings and the Niners, and we'll see how it all plays out.
All right. Thanks, guys. Appreciate you having me.
Yes, sir. That's Chris Biderman, senior reporter for the Sacramento Bee.